name is Marie-Kell Cannart, and I will be presenting my thesis on an acoustic data analysis of potential shared group calls of short-fin pilot whales in the Canary Islands. So I will be starting out with an introduction, going through the different points of my thesis, and ending with recommendations and a conclusion. So as we all know, cetaceans rely very heavily on acoustic signals because sound travels 5 times faster in water than it does in the air. And so these Odontocetes use vocalizations for many purposes, such as communication strategies, which are very important with their social structure, to be able to recognize members inside of their pod or outside of their pod, for prey echolocation, so they actually see with sound, and to maintain especially their group cohesion and their society. So we have two model species here on the right that we will base our study on. So the killer whales have actually a vocal repertoire, so they have group calls that they all use. The bottlenose dolphins have signature whistles. So this means that they have a particular call that they identify each other with. So where exactly do the short fin pilot whales lie in between all this? That is what we want to figure out. They need to maintain their society and that they do have communication strategies. And we also know that they follow a constant companion model throughout different years with the same individuals beside each other. So they actually have very long-lasting relationships with the individuals in their pod. So a bit about vocalizations. Here we have the monkey lips. So this is what produces the sound thanks to pressurized volume of air that passes through them. So if it makes a continuous vibration, we get calls such as medium frequency, low frequency, two-component calls. And then if it is a discontinuous call, we get clicks or rasps and buzzes. So in this study, we will be focusing on the medium frequency calls. Vocal learning is also to underline. So it is the ability to produce a new sound after hearing it for the first time. So we all know that humans are capable of this. We can reproduce a song or a word or a new language. And there are a few other non-human animals in the world that can do this as well, and cetaceans are part of those. So what is it exactly? It's actually a very good control over the vocal apparatus. So you can modify the respiratory system, the phonatory system, and the filter system, which makes it possible to change the duration of the sound, the modulations, etc. Next, we have the complexity index. And this is something that we will be analyzing of every single call. So it is based on the tortuosity property of curves and slopes of about everything in the world, such as a river here. And so we will be linking this with the possibility that less complex calls are more easily learned and then therefore shared. Our aims and hypotheses, we want to identify if there are group-specific calls. We do believe that there are. We want to compare the different categorizations that we will be doing. So one will be done with an algorithm and the other will be done with a visual analysis. And we do believe that the visual analysis is more reliable. And then we want to also look at the complexity of the calls and see if it is linked with the vocal learning ability. And we do believe that simpler calls are thus more easily learned. So the study area was in the southwest coast of Tenerife, between Punta Teno and Punta Rasca, which is part of a special conservation zone. The data was gathered in 2004, 2006, and 2008, thanks to D-tags. So D-tags have these suction cups that are attached to one particular animal, and once there is sufficient data in the D-tag, there is a programmed release that then allows the D-tag to come back to the surface and then be recuperated by the researchers. So all of this data is stored in MATLAB, and so we have to extract the calls that are interesting for this research. So like I said before, we are focusing on medium frequency calls. We selected calls that were longer than 0.5 seconds and that were also on the focal animal, as you can see here. So the calls that come from the animal on whom the D-tag was put on. So we want the spectrograms and the frequency contours. So the first analysis was done with a software also from MATLAB called ArtWarp. And so what this software does, so it's a neural network algorithm that collects all the frequency contours that it was given. It shifts through all of them. It selects reference contours for the categories. And then based on those reference contours, puts multiple different contours that actually fit with them with a certain degree of similarity. And then for a second analysis, what we did was a visual observation. So we classified all of the calls visually with one trained observer and one untrained observer. And so we followed these 8 different elements that are composed of frequency characteristics. So here on the right side, for example, we can see that the first element is N shape, the second element is a long descending element, and this is all part of one sequence. So if there was a break in the middle, there would be 2 sequences in one call. And so all of these were classified based on the same characteristics. The complexity index, we used 5 different formulas that were extracted from MATLAB, so all around the same tortuosity property. And so each frequency contour had 5 different numbers that were calculated from these formulas. So we wanted to see which one of these indexes was the most similar or most reliable compared to the actual complexity of the calls. So what we did was we classified all of the calls into 3 different grades of complexity. So we had red for the most complex, orange, so grade 2 and grade 3. And so here's an example of each one of them. And so what I then did was I filtered each column independently from smallest to largest number, meaning that logically all of the largest numbers at the bottom would be the most complex calls. And so thanks to the color code, we would be able to figure out which index was the most suitable. So for the results, we had a total of 111 frequency contours that were extracted from MATLAB. As you can see here, this pie chart represents the amount of calls per groups. So there were a few groups that only had 1 call that was extracted, and other groups that had 35 calls that were extracted. Here is the first artwork analysis that was done. So here on the top row, you can see the reference contours in red. And then each category contains a different number of classified calls. The 2 arrows here indicate the 2 group calls that were categorized by artwork. So that means that 2 different individuals here have produced each a call. Here is a summary of the different categorizations. So the 2 I just mentioned here on the left from artwork 33, I called it because there were 33 categories. So there are 2 shared calls. Here's one with individual B and D from group 296 from the year 2004. The second artwork analysis had 24 categories, and there were 8 of them that had shared calls. And then the visual analysis had a total of 26 categories, and we also had 2 categories that had shared calls. So this call type here with 2 individuals was found in each one of the analysis, and then this call type was also created by the second analysis, second algorithm analysis. Here is a visual representation. So we have here the call types that were selected by each analysis, by all 3 of them. So we can see that the spectrograms are very similar. The frequency contours are also very similar. We just have one issue, that is the maximum frequency in the spectrogram here is 90 and here is 45. And that is because of different sampling rates from the data gathering that was done in 16 years ago. Here on this side, we have the second call that was classified as a group call by the visual analysis that is also similar to the one to the second analysis, where we can see the spectrograms are also very similar and the frequency contours as well. We just have the issue as well of 90 and 45 for the maximum frequency. Here we have a small issue from the artwork, so it's an error from artwork. We can visually clearly say that these 2 calls do not belong in the same category. However, one of the artwork 24 analysis categorized them in the same group. Here we also have another error from whistle params, which is the tool that extracted all of the frequency contours. So it took actually part of this second call behind into consideration for the frequency contour, which created frequency contour that is not possible, and thus categorized these 2 calls into different categories when in fact they should be in the same call. Here's the complexity index. So this is just a visual impression of it, and we chose index number 2 because, as you can see, most of the red color is on the bottom, and then it gradually goes to green. So here there's a bunch of them missing. Here there's a big part of yellow, and then here there's still one red one up there, and this one is far away from what it should be. So we chose index 2 as the most reliable complexity index. We also figured out that all of the categorized calls that were in group calls were actually very simple calls. So they were calls that had a grade 3 complexity. So we could say that vocal learning and shared calls actually have an easier complexity, so they could be easier to share and learn. But since all the rest of the calls had all 3 grades, this was unfortunately non-conclusive. So it is not possible to draw any conclusions about the group or individual calls due to quite a few limitations. However, comparing artwork analysis with the visual analysis was very interesting, and we have quite a few suggestions for future research. And like I just mentioned, the complexity grades are unfortunately not conclusive. So for data limitation, with the 111 frequency contours that we had, that was not enough to be able to determine whether there are group calls or not, because some of them have one frequency contour that was extracted, some of them had 25, so that is an unequal distribution of frequency contours and data in general. The data was also collected over 5 different years, and so there's a possibility of dialects that can result from that. So, so the same years should be collected, or at least compared between the same years. The contours, the frequency contours, as we saw, there were a few glitches because of the programs that were used. Then the spectrogram frequencies had different maximum frequencies, and they had different sampling frequencies, so that should be arranged in the future. And then the segmentation is something that MATLAB could not take into consideration, which the visual observation did. So for the data limitation, there should be a continuous monitoring of all species, of all calls. Every year there should be a catalog of these calls that should be updated regularly and should be actually personally known. It's also important to take the emotional state of the individuals into consideration. The behavioral context is very important for calls, especially if we're comparing calls. They should come from the same behavioral context, otherwise we don't know what is actually happening. We did not have any audio analysis for this categorization, but it's very interesting to be able to listen to the calls to maybe see something or hear something that you couldn't see in the spectrograms. And then playback studies are something that is very important. There's a detailed step-by-step explanation by Fisher et al. That explains that actually replaying the calls that you have taken, and you have to replay them back actually to the species in the wild, is something that is very important to be able to know what their feedback is based on what you considered is probably a shared call. So all in all, we know that it is not possible that there are shared or group calls with this data and the current algorithm. However, this was a first try with the artwork algorithm for short fin pilot whales. So it is very good for big data because visual analysis takes a lot of human time. However, visual analysis is very good to be able to improve the results in case of glitches or other problems. So this subject remains very important for future research to be able to understand the complexity of such social structures of short fin pilot whales, and can also help us maybe to protect the species in a better way. So I want to thank everyone that has made it possible in this master's and for my thesis, and thank you very much for your attention.